So by 1750, North America looked someone like this. We have the English colonies over here. The French are going to be in Canada, down here in Louisiana. The Spanish are now in Florida. They're populating Texas, and they're also in New Mexico. Little bit about that before we begin. Here's a better image of it. Um, the populations of these various regions are going to be incredibly different from one another. So as we talked about before, English colonization of the Americas is based on land. If you get over here and you get land which is in abundance with the death of Indians due to disease and the English forcing them westward, the only thing that you need is to basically get passage over here and you're going to be successful. And we're going to see a lot of natural childbirth in the English colonies because disease isn't going to be as prevalent as some of these southern areas, although in the southern colonies it's going to be more prevalent than up here. So what we're going to have is a lot of people coming from England claiming this land, and then all you have to do to be successful is get this cheap land and grow a surplus of crops. Maybe send the surplus to market if you're successful enough. And we got a lot of people having multiple children up here in New England, Puritans having a lot of children, and then this natural childbirth increasing their numbers. So while this map shows the English as having not very many or not very much land, in reality they're going to have over 1 million people. It's probably a higher estimate of 1.5 million by 1750. But you compare this to what the French have. So the French, if you're looking just based on colors and on a map, it looks like the French control a lot more than the English. But as we discussed, the French are not densely populating this area. They're just sending a couple fur traders out, and again, there's some agriculturalists, things like that, towards the more northern areas. But this area is mainly populated by a handful of fur traders, a couple of missionaries, and then a couple of soldiers. That's really it. And so it's not densely populated. Now, again, as we mentioned, Louisiana, the French had only recently started to settle at the beginning of the 1700s, and while it had been increasing in number by 1750, it's still only 20,000 in part because there's a lot of deaths due to disease, and natural childbirth is having a hard time replacing deaths due to disease. So you controlling a lot of areas, but not controlling, not having a large population. So the Spanish, if you're looking what's today present day United States, the Spanish are in Florida. They had set up St. Augustine. They'd actually set up another fort over here in the western part of Florida to prevent the French from expanding. They had missions in the past previously, but they'd mostly been abandoned because of Indian deaths, or they had already converted Indians. So they don't have a lot of people here in Florida, and most of the people here are just soldiers stationed here to, sort of guard the region. The Spanish, again, they have tons of people down here in New Spain, as you had, Indians forcefully incorporated in their empire. You had missionaries, and then the Indians they had converted, soldiers. By this point, there have been plenty of childbirth between Spaniards and Indians, things like that. So plenty of people down here, but in the area of the United States, again, not many people in Florida. Texas, you just had a handful of missionaries, a handful of missionized Indians, and you'd had a handful of soldiers to prevent the French expansion. You're not getting a lot of people moving to Texas because it's a great place, because there's not a way to make money. Again, if you're coming in, from somewhere outside of this region, you're probably going to be going to exploit the silver mines. Up here in New Mexico, the population of Spanish New Mexico had actually decreased significantly over the years, even though the Spanish had converted a number of Pueblo Indians into Spaniards by this point. As the Spanish are populating this area, again, a lot of Pueblos are dying off of disease, things like that. So this is a low estimate, probably, of how many Spaniards you have by 1750, but even upwards estimates 40,000, maybe 50,000. The French, again, 70,000, maybe 80,000 as a high estimate. But you compare that to the English low estimate more than 1 million, that's going to mean that the English have substantially larger population in spite of the fact they don't control a lot of this area. Um, what we're about to see is the English and the French are about to have a fight over North America. The French are going to join the Spanish to their side, but it's going to be a face-off, which on paper doesn't look like it's going to be close if you have over 1 million people versus 80,000 people. But as we're going to talk about, the French are going to have some advantages in this fight. Um, and another thing you should probably know before we actually talk about this fight, by 1750s, when this 7 Years' War is going to break out, the British, and I'm going to use the term British because the English basically call themselves British as they've now started expanding their empire. They've incorporated Scotland, parts of Ireland, some overseas colonies in Africa, in India as well. These British have become more powerful than Spain, much more powerful than Spain. As we talked about before, the British had defeated the Spanish Armada in the 1580s, and then Spanish continued to invest heavily in their navy. But the English merchant navy continued to be bigger than the Spanish navy, and the British, as they're starting to take some of this wealth from the New World, had started to invest in a military navy, like a navy to fight other ships. So the British had become this dominant naval power, and they'd use this to their advantage. And this is part of this reason by the 1750s, the British had used their navy to claim areas in the Caribbean from Spain, because Spain, again, we talked about this before, spending money on these religious wars, this bloated bureaucracy, overexpansion, these type of things had led Spain to decline. Its military power declined. Its navy failed to catch up with what the British were producing. And all this is in spite of the fact that the Spanish continue to produce a lot of silver here. So think about 1700s, England's power on the rise, while Spain's a power in decline. By the mid 1700s, France is also a power on the rise. So what's going to happen is as Spain declines, Britain and France will start challenging one another for becoming the dominant power in the world. The French are going to become this dominant power because they're going to be using their army to, create, take over territory in Europe, create new allies in Europe, and using again a massive amount of land under their control to grow their population. The French are also going to be profiting, although not as much as the British, from the agriculture produced from Louisiana and some of the fur coming out of Canada. The French are really going to be profiting because they've turned this Haiti into this sugar producing empire. The French had taken Haiti and these sugar islands over here from the Spanish and previous wars. So both the British and the French are starting to expand overseas, and they're using the profits from what they get overseas to expand their military might. Again, the French are going to become this dominant military power in part because of sort of the devotion to scientific knowledge and being at the forefront of military thought, large population. The British are going to become this dominant naval power. Again, they already had a big civilian merchant fleet, but they're going to match it by investing in a large naval fleet. So what happens in the 1700s is we're going to see as Spain declines, Britain and France are going to get into a series of wars almost, I can't say every decade. Well, yeah, every decade they're going to get into a war with one another for one reason or another. There's going to be a war at the beginning of the 1700s, this War of Spanish Succession. The British and French fight over, actually who's going to take over the Spanish crown, which is interesting. There's going to be another war over trade routes in the Americas at the early 1700s. There's going to be another war, this War of Austrian Succession in the mid 1700s. The only thing you need to know about these wars is they didn't really affect the Americas. What would happen when these various powers get in a fight is they would fight over in Europe, but in the Americas, not much would happen. So if there's a battle, or if there's a war over in Europe, maybe the French and Spanish would join together. Their families are related at this point, so if they're They're going to join together whenever there's going to be a major fight, more often than not. But what would maybe happen is maybe you would see the English send an expedition to try to take St. Augustine. Doesn't happen. That's it. Or maybe you would see the French up here. Okay, we're at war with the English. What we'll do is we'll arm some Indians and we'll send them down to attack English settlements down here. Wars in Europe didn't really affect what's happening in North America vast majority of the time. So Britain and France on the rise in constant wars, these rarely affect the Americas. The one exception will be the War of Austrian Succession. This little island right here, Nova Scotia, this used to be French. The French had claimed it, and there had been maybe 10,000 Frenchmen that lived on this area, these Acadians. Basically, the British claimed this as part of the War of the Austrian Succession, but they just left the Acadians there. They didn't even bother to move them. It's just now this is our territory, not yours. So think about it this way: constant fighting between these various powers, but for the most part, this is going to be the Americas will be left out of them, out of the fights. Again, if there is something that changes hands, it'll probably be something that happens down in the Caribbean. All right, so things are going to change in 1753 because in 1753 we're not only going to see a war affect the Americas, but it's going to start in the Americas, and it's going to start in this location uh, in between the French colonies and the British colonies. In this area today, we call the Ohio Valley. All right, so what had happened by 1753, we just talked about this, is the English, they had started to densely pack this Atlantic coast. Not every piece of available land, but a significant chunk of available land east of these Appalachian Mountains had been claimed by the British. They'd stopped giving out free land a long time before this. But land, it's still cheaper than you would have in England, but it's not nearly going to be as cheap as it was before. And part of this is because a lot of the cash crops, particularly cash crops in the southern colonies, what would happen is you would grow some of these cash crops, particularly tobacco, and the soil can only support tobacco crops for a couple years. It takes the nitrogen out of the soil, and then basically what you would have to do is move west, grab new land, grow tobacco there, move west, grab new land, and that's not going to be an issue prior to the 1750s because, again, due to death due to disease and the English forcing the Indians off their land, there's going to be plenty of land available, and it's extremely cheap. But by the 1750s, it's the land east of the Appalachians is either more expensive or it's already been used up. It's not good for growing tobacco any longer. So what you're going to have in the 1750s is some Englishmen start looking west of the Appalachian Mountains to this Ohio Valley area and basically saying, all right, land's becoming more expensive over here, but over here in this Ohio Valley, there's a lot of fertile land there. There have been a handful of explorers, English explorers, that gone out to this region. They discovered, hey, there are French fur traders out here. There's a handful of French forts out here, but for the most part, it's empty. And as we talked about, even though we're claiming the French land over here, in reality, the French are scattered in fur trading posts, forts, things like that. So some English are going to get the idea we need to expand and maybe we should lay claim to this area that the French are now claiming as theirs. One of the people that think the English should expand into this Ohio Valley is going to be a young man named George Washington. Now, George Washington didn't look like this in 1753. In 1753, he was a young 21-year-old kid. He was born to a wealthy family. George Washington's from this family, one of the first English families to arrive in Virginia, and his family had made a lot of money off the tobacco trade. His family had acquired a lot of land. They then purchased a lot of African slaves, used these slaves to grow tobacco, and they had made wealth from it. And this had allowed the Washington family to educate George Washington and his father and people before him in ways that you wouldn't see most Southerners being able to receive education. Again, Puritan New England, you're going to have a high degree of literacy, and you still do in the British South, but it's not going to be to the degree it is in New England. Except for when you see these wealthy families like George Washington's, who, again, expendable capital, hire tutors and things like that. So George Washington is going to be very wealthy compared to his neighbors, very well educated, and this education is going to earn him a job as a land surveyor. Basically, George Washington will start making maps for these land surveyors. So, what was a land speculator? You can think of the land speculator as a middleman between the British Crown and the settlers in the Americas. So, what would happen is, let's say the British got into a conflict with an Indian group in this area. Indian group attacked the British after they started clearing their hunting grounds. The British, using their superior weapons, defeat the Indians and then force them to move west and sign over this area to British settlers. Well, they wouldn't sign it over to the British settlers, they would actually sign it over to the King of England. Well, the king would then have this chunk of land in the Americas. He doesn't know how to operate it, probably doesn't even know anything about the war with the Indians. It's just a chunk of land over here. Well, what then would then happen is this land would be parceled out or sold to land speculators. They would buy it directly from the crown, and then the land speculators would parcel the land out for sale to individual colonists. So sometimes this would be done at the state level. So maybe the state of Virginia would take land from Indians. The governor would take the land from the Indians, signed over to the governor, and then essentially, because the governor worked for the king, signing over for the king, and then the land would be bought by the land speculators. So king gets it as part of the war. Land speculators buy it from the crown for, I'm just making up a number here, £1,000, and then the land speculators would go to this land, parcel it out into like 60-acre plots, something like that, and then they would go to individual settlers and sell it to them. So in order to do this, you need somebody to actually map the land. Well, one of the people that land speculators would hire to map the land is George Washington. Educated, knew how to write, knew how to draw maps, that type of thing. So George Washington had this previous job of mapping out land, and some of this had taken him across the Appalachian Mountains to the Ohio Territory. So land speculators, maybe hire him to map this land here for land resale. And they would also send out these scouts to map future land acquisition. So maybe if we acquire this land from the French in a war, we'll need to help parceling it out. So George Washington was one of the few people east of the Appalachian Mountains who had crossed over into this Ohio Valley. He knew what the land was like west of the Appalachian Mountains. So in 1753, the land speculators will hire, or it's not the land speculators will hire George Washington. The governor of Virginia is going to get it into his mind that this area east of Virginia should be part of England's claim. Basically, the governor of Virginia, again, the governor is the guy that's presiding over the House of Burgesses, who lets the House of Burgesses take the day-to-day operations. He's just representing the king's interests. But he decides, takes it on his own, he actually doesn't consult the crown about this, that he wants this land to be claimed for Britain. He doesn't think the French should own this, and he wants to claim this for Britain. And so what he's going to decide to do, again without authorization, is hire this young George Washington kid, smart kid, land speculator, one of the few people that had been west of the Appalachian Mountains, to go to the Ohio Valley, find the nearest French fort, and inform the commander of the fort that this territory is now English territory or British territory. Well, why is he doing this? You could just say, as governor of Virginia, he's saying, all right, we're running out of land here. I'm going to take it in my prerogative to go here, exert British control. In reality, the governor of Virginia actually had stake in the land speculating company. Some people think he's telling George Washington to go out there, start a war with France. Maybe the British will come in and help us out. We'll get the Ohio Valley. Then we'll have a ton of land to sell off. The British will acquire this land. We'll then buy it from the British government and then sell it to individual colonists. Some people think he's doing this underhanded wise, but let's just take him for his word and basically say that he thinks the Ohio Valley should be the British, doesn't think there's enough French in this area to stake French claim to the land. So it's 1753, when he sends George Washington. The British and French had just gotten out of the War of Austrian Succession a couple years before. I think it's 6, 7 years before, something like that. So he's telling this young kid to go find the French and tell them the Ohio Valley is now British territory. Fort Machald, it's a little bit off here, but George Washington is going to cross into this area and he will find the first French fort. And I want you to imagine him as going to the door and knocking on the door of this French fort. Again, not exactly how it happened. Knocks on the door, and you're going to have this French officer come to the door. And remember, at this time period, the French are the toughest soldiers around. So I want you to think of this French commander coming to the front door of this fort like, "Who are you, young man?" And George Washington's sitting there, sort of in his shadow. And the French commander is going to say to Washington, or Washington's going to say to the French commander, the governor of Virginia just said that he wanted me to deliver this message telling you to leave this fort and to tell all you French to abandon this Ohio Valley because this is officially British territory, sir. Well, the French commander, basically say, "We've been here. We've had French fur traders in this region for 100 years. We have forts in this region. The Indians of this area have been trading with us for a long time. This is French territory. Go tell your governor, you know, shut up. We're not going anywhere." And so I want you to imagine George Washington turns around and the French commander kicking him in the butt, telling him to go home to talk to the Virginia governor. Again, didn't really kick him in the butt, but George Washington will return in 1753 and tell the governor of Virginia, the French commander said this is French territory, and then he kicked me in the butt, and he'll tell him the French refused to recognize British claim to the Ohio Valley. All right, so the Virginia governor at this point is going to decide, all right, well, what I want you to do, Washington, is I want you to take 100 British redcoats. We're going to talk about these guys more in a second, but they're professional soldiers whose job it is to fight. Take 100 of these guys, get 200 militiamen. Militiamen are just farmers, carpenters who grab a gun and during certain military times. Take these guys, head out to this French fort, and what I want you to do is, head out as far west as you can. So if the French fort is here, I want you to go just east of it and stake as much claim as you can for the British. So if the French are here, I want you to go right as far east as you can and build a fort. So basically you'll stake all the land east of this fort for the British. So if they're not going to leave, we're going to claim as much of this land as we can. And particularly, he's going to tell George Washington, go to this area where there's 3 rivers. It's about the area that's today Pittsburgh. All right, so Washington's going to head out with his 300 men in 1754, and he's going to go to form this fort. But when he arrives there, he discovers that while he's been gone, the French have built their own fort in the exact same place that he was going to build his fort. They basically predicted what the British are going to do, and they sort of superseded them by building a fort as far east as they could. So Washington's not going to be able to build a fort in the location he wanted to. So he gets there, and he's going to look basically and see this new French fort, and he's like, oh, darn, what am I supposed to do now? Well, Washington is going to do something that so Washington, a lot of cool stuff, but he's going to have one sort of pock mark on his record, and that's going to happen in 1754. So at this point, the French and the British aren't at war. Again, they've been in the War of Austrian Succession not too long ago, but at this point, they're not at war, and he's in an area where the French believe it to be their territory. In spite of this, Washington is going to decide to attack a patrol from this new French fort, this Fort Duquesne. So the French are sending these soldiers out. Just this is what the way they operated to patrol the region. And one of these patrols, something like 20 men, is out, hey, we're doing French soldier stuff, goofing around. Washington and his men will ambush them and kill them. Some of the French soldiers are going to get away, but they kill these French soldiers on territory the French believe is theirs. So now Washington is in this area that French claim is theirs. The surviving soldiers have gone to Fort Duquesne to report the English are in our territory, and they've started killing our men. Well, Washington realizes he needs to do something and do something quick. And in particular, he knows the French are going to be coming after him. The French are probably going to be coming with Indian allies, again, because the French, in general, have better alliances with Indians. And at this point, a lot of the Indians in this area, I should probably mention, are Indian groups that had already been pushed west by the British. They've been forced over the Appalachian Mountains. So they're not going to want the idea of the British coming in here. They're not going to like that. So they're going to join with the French. So Washington needs to do something quick, and he particularly needs to build this fort. Again, he couldn't build it where he wanted because the French are there. So what he's going to decide to do is look for a different location for a fort, and he's got to do it, build this fort quickly because, again, the French are on their way. Well, Washington, again, is a land speculator. His family had made a lot of money in tobacco. He's very well educated, but he's not a good military strategist. If you or I were building a fort, we'd probably look for a place that's elevated so you can see people coming around you. You're having to fire weapons upwards, which is, make it more difficult to hit somebody inside of the fort. You don't want something with trees all around you because then people could hide as they're firing at the fort. You want something adjacent to water, all those type of things. You want maybe something with natural defenses, maybe like on edge of a cliff or something where there's not a lot of approaches to the fort. Well, if you or I were building this, we'd probably be able to fight off the French, or we might be able to fight off the French. But Washington is a terrible fort builder. He's going to build this fort, which he's going to call Fort Necessity, because I need to build this thing or else I'm going to get killed by these French guys. He's going to build this in the middle of a valley, so surrounded by tall hills, in a valley that's surrounded by trees. This is a recreation of it. This is in a park or something like that. So this is what it's going to look like. You can't criticize Washington for how kind of shoddy it looks because he's got to build it really quick. But you certainly can criticize him for building it in a valley and again, a place where there's a lot of trees around it. And this is obviously going to be a problem because on July 4th, 1754, the French will arrive with some 600 professional French soldiers and some Indian allies. And again, the French are best trained soldiers in the world, and they've got a number of Indian allies, and they're now marching down on this poorly constructed, poorly located fort. Well, fortunately for Washington, he's going to have with him to defend Fort Necessity 100 British redcoats. So when we first started talking about European powers, most of the people fighting were dudes that had some weapons, fought for the governor of Virginia, or fought for the crown or whatever, but they're not trained soldiers like we have today. British redcoats are soldiers like the modern version of a soldier. They're paid for serving a set amount of time, so you'd sign a contract for a year, 2 years, and your job during this 2 years would be to serve in the British military. You're spending your time training, you're spending your time practicing firing, you're practicing tactics, you're doing things that soldiers do, and you're training to when gunshots start ringing out, you run towards the gunfire, you start firing back at it. You're not afraid because you've trained for this moment. So they're professional soldiers. Washington's got 100 of these dudes, probably not as well trained as the French soldiers, just because the British aren't at the French's level in military strategy just yet, but they're still very professional. Unfortunately for Washington, 200 of his men are these guys. 200 of his guys are militia. Guys that are just getting off the couch, grabbing a gun, and then heading off to whatever, to fight somebody. Okay, so they're not professional soldiers. This guy would be a farmer. This is Carl from Aqua Team Hunger Force. He's just sitting on the couch doing whatever he's doing, and then fighting breaks out. Somebody grabs him off the couch, gives him a gun, and then heads off to war. This is what the group that had done most of the fighting in the English colonies against Indians. Whenever an Indian group would attack, basically local leader, whoever runs the town, would say, I need all adult males, whatever your job is, farmer, carpenter, blacksmith, something like that. You come here and then grab a gun and we'll go attack whoever the Indians attacked them. Now this would work against the various Indian groups the colonists would get in fights with because, again, they don't have the technology that the British have, and so you can defeat them even if it's Joe Schmo off the couch fighting. That's not going to be the same going up against a professional army, okay? This guy, whenever fighting starts, he's going to do what a farmer would do, what a carpenter would do, which is if gunshots start ringing out, you're probably hiding. You're not trained to fire back. You're not trained to in these tactics for what to do when gunshots are ringing out. So Washington's going to be stuck with these 200 militia. He's got 100 professional soldiers, 200 militia, but he's going against, again, 600 French soldiers and their Indian allies. And when the French arrive at Fort Necessity, what's going to happen is probably what you would expect to happen. The French are going to come in, and they're going to come in under the cover of trees because, again, Washington built his fort in a horrible location, and they're going to start firing from the hill outside of Fort Necessity. They're actually able to fire into the fort, so they're at such an elevation. People inside of it will be hit because the French are and their Indian allies will start firing into the fort and killing the people inside. As a matter of fact, the Redcoats, who professional soldiers, they're going to determine, well, forget this fort. We're going to go out in front of it. Better job of fighting out there, and they're going to go out and decide to fight in this direction. But again, they're facing off against superior odds. The militia, they're going to just start getting drunk and crying and, what do we do? We're getting attacked. And this is going to turn out to be a disaster for George Washington. Built his whole fort in this horrible location. He actually gets, I think, a horse shot out from under him, like a bullet goes through his coat, doesn't hit him. But his men are starting to fall left and right. And very soon, Washington's going to realize, I'm not going to win this thing. I take this back. The battle starts on July 3rd, but by July 4th, Washington understands this thing's not going well. And on July 4th, 1754, Washington will surrender Fort Necessity to the French. They're not going to kill them. They're going to basically strip their weapons. In a lot of instances, I don't know about this particular one, they would take the uniforms off the people. They would take, their nice clothes, and they would just send them back weaponless. So I want you to sort of imagine Washington being sent back to the governor of Virginia wearing like underwear, like the 1700s puffy underwear or something like that after the French kick his butt. One thing interesting here is that basically right after he surrendered Fort Necessity, the French get in here like Washington's like, I turn the fort over to you. I don't want this crap. Like the French just destroy it. Like they have a fort right up the river anyway, and this fort was poorly built, so they just tear this stupid thing down. So Washington's going to have to go back in 1754, and he's going to say to Governor of Virginia, they kicked my butt. They killed a lot of my men, and they took my clothes and guns, and they were a bunch of jerks, and they destroyed my fort. And he's going to complain that once again the French have kicked me out of this area that again, if anybody's claiming it besides the Indians, it would probably be the French. Well, some people are going to start calling on the governor of Virginia to get the British to go to war. Well, word will arrive of this conflict in the Ohio Valley back in England, and in Parliament and the king are going to hear about it, and they're going to sort of say, this isn't worth going to war over. We just got out of war with France. It was expensive. This is over here in the colonies. We're not necessarily too worried about them. This isn't worth fighting for. So what you're going to see in 1754, 1755 is the British and French are sort of upset with each other over this Ohio Valley, but they're not ready to go to war just yet. So kind of imagine it like two brothers, they always get in fights, but they don't want to fight because they know maybe they'll get in trouble or something. They start calling each other names, but they know if they start punching, trouble's going to happen. So they'll just like maybe get close and like put their finger near the other person's face just to annoy them. That's what's going to happen 1754, 1755 into 1756. As we're going to see, Britain and France don't want to go to war just yet, but they're going to start doing things that will annoy the other side, all right? So what does this mean? Well, one thing the British are going to do is they're going to say, all right, we're not going to go to full war with the French, but if you're a British merchant, so just a private citizen, maybe somebody who ships tobacco from Britain to, or from Virginia to Britain, something like that, or maybe somebody who, a British fisherman, colonist, or otherwise, and you happen to run across a French vessel, you can go ahead and capture it. All right, this isn't the government doing it, so our private citizens are doing it, so this won't cause a war, but we're mad at France, so just go ahead and capture the French vessel. So we'll see British ships just capturing, or private British citizens capturing French ships. The French will retaliate by authorizing their merchants to go ahead and capture British vessels. Again, I'm not full on war. I'm just sticking my finger in your face. Another thing the British are going to do is they're going to decide to do something about the French that were on this Nova Scotia or this Acadia. So we didn't talk about this here, but in the, very briefly before, but this Nova Scotia had been home to about 10,000 or so French at the end of the War of Austrian Succession. The French lost that war, and they're going to be forced to sign Nova Scotia over to the British. British take possession of this, but what do they do with the 10,000 French on the island? Initially, the British say, whatever, just leave them there. They're just a bunch of farmers. Nobody cares about them. And so they leave them there, but 1755, it's starting to look like, hey, we might be going to war with the French soon. We don't want 10,000 of their citizens sitting in this sort of strategically important region. So the British are going to go to the Acadians and say, you guys need to GTFO. You got to leave. This is a British possession. You guys are French. We don't want you here anymore. You got to get out. All right, so the French Acadians are going to have a decision to make. Where do I go? British say I can't stay here. Well, some Acadians will move to France. A lot of them have been born, you have multiple generations at this point living in the area. Some don't want to leave their home, but, what am I supposed to do? Well, some Acadians are going to say, I don't have any connection in France. I don't have anybody there. Maybe I can move to a different area where France still controls. You'll see a handful move to Canada, but some are going to hear about this Louisiana and how there's decent amount of land still available down there. And you'll see about 5,000 Acadians. I've heard different numbers for that, but a good chunk of Acadians are going to be deported, forcefully forced to leave by the British, and a good chunk are going to decide to pick up and then move to Louisiana. So basically, the British, you got to leave, you can't stay here. 5,000 or so Acadians pick up, and then they're going to head to French Louisiana. So, all right, we're going to be under French flag yet again. So they get down to Louisiana. What these Acadians are going to find is when they arrive is that a lot of the good land, the stuff on the Mississippi, the well-watered, really fertile stuff, has already been taken. So some of these Acadians are going to end up moving into these swampy, less good lands. And when they move there, they're going to be importing their culture that they developed here on Acadia. This area is really good for growing wheat, for example. So they had this nice Acadian bread. Well, they're going to get down here and they're going to find their French, companions growing corn and, okra and rice and stuff like that. And they're going to say, yeah, I don't necessarily like this stuff. I like my bread and all that. And so they're going to try to make their wheat work in this new culture. And what you're going to see is this weird blending of this Canadian style French culture with this Louisiana style French culture. And these Acadians are going to sort of come to be known as Cajuns or swamp people. If you think of people in the backwoods of Louisiana, a lot of them are descendants of these Acadians. So you had the original French moved down here early 1700s, mid 1700s. A huge chunk are to move from Acadia, and this is where you get stuff. If you ever go to New Orleans, like beignets, po' boys, shrimp, which are native to the area. But then you have the bread, and the bread would sort of be brought by the Acadians. So a weird combination of different types of French cultures mixed with, native stuff or stuff native to Louisiana. So that's something the British do to the French. Well, the French are going to be doing things to sort of poke at the British 1755 into 1756. One of the things the French are going to do is they're going to say to their various Indian allies in this region, hey, if you guys go attack the British, we'll provide you with arms, we'll give you firearms, we'll give you gunpowder, hatchets, knives, that type of thing. And a lot of these Indian groups had already been pushed west by the British. They don't want to be pushed west further, so they're going to take this French offer, and we'll see them start raiding across the mountains and attacking the British, these British colonists, sort of at this frontier right here. We see a series of these raids by these Indians into British territory. So again, the British are going to complain. The French are going to say, "Hey, this isn't me doing it. These guys are doing it. I don't have anything to do with it." Not only that, so again, this is another thing that starts happening 1755, where these guys start poking each other. The British are actually going to try to send a third expedition under a guy named Braddock. Washington will be a part of this expedition. They're just going to basically say, even though we're at war, we're just going to try and take Fort Duquesne. Braddock ends up getting killed. Washington takes control of the men, and he's going to get his butt kicked a third time and have to come back and tell the governor of Virginia, I lost the third time. If you ever play the Assassin's Creed games, Assassin's Creed 3 starts with this third expedition into French territory. So you basically have the British and French at war at sea, the French using Indians as proxies to fight the British. The British again, forcing the Acadians to leave Nova Scotia. These guys start poking each other so much that by 1756, both the French and British are going to finally say, you know what, let's just have a full-out war. I know we just got out of this war a little bit before, but we don't like each other. Let's start fighting. And so in 1756, you're going to see the beginning of the 7 Years' War. 7 Years' War, we call it 7 Years' War because it lasts 7 years, although, you could even define it as a 9 years war because a lot of this fighting starts in 54, but 7 years war between the British and French. That's not the only name for this war, though. What else have we heard? You'll sometimes hear it referred to as the French and Indian War. Not a lot of people call it that anymore because usually when you have a war like U.S.-Mexico War, it's U.S. versus Mexico, or Spanish-American War, Spanish versus America. The French are not going to be fighting Indians, or at least most Indians will be siding with the French because of their pre-existing trade partnerships. A handful of Indians will side with the British, but most that are going to be fighting, either have a good relationship with the French or they don't like the British because they've been forced west. So the vast majority of Indians will be fighting with the French. So it doesn't make a lot of sense to say French and Indian. If you're going to call it something like that, would be the French and Indian versus the British War. But again, I like 7 Years' War better. And another reason maybe you shouldn't call this a French and Indian War, because that implies that the fighting is going to take place almost exclusively in North America. In reality, that's not the case. What we're really going to see is this is just one theater in a larger conflict. There's going to be fighting in the Caribbean. There's going to be tons of fighting in Europe. There'll be plenty of fighting off the coast of Africa and on the coast of Africa, India, Asia. They'll also be fighting. What basically happens is when war's declared between these two powers, they'll start to click up with their friends. French will look to the Spanish. They're going to join with them. The English will get help from Portuguese, Russia. Who else? I would guess that's Prussia No, no, the Russians joined the French and the Spanish. I think it's the Prussians that joined the British and the Portuguese. And basically, what you're going to have is almost a First World War. And you look down here, you're going to see some fighting down here from these coastal slave colonies, fighting over here between the French and the British over India, and some fighting over here in the West Indies as well, or East Indies as well. So some people call the 7 Years' War the First World War. Setting all that to the side, what you're going to have is when the Years' War starts, both sides are going to have advantages and disadvantages over one another. So England, obviously, you would say way more people here than the French. As we talked about before, 70, 80,000 in the entirety of this region. The British, they're going to have over 1 million in this area, so they're going to outnumber the French 15 to 1 maybe in this war. A lot more people. The British are going to have the naval advantage. Again, they have the large merchant fleet, and they've been building this large navy. The French have been building a navy too, but the British have this advantage at this point. The Spanish and the French are going to have join up with each other. I mentioned that before. One thing that they will have going for them is the French actually have more professional soldiers in the New World than the British. So the British have more people, but a lot of them are colonists who don't see it as their duty to fight these type of wars. The colonists basically see it as their responsibility to fight Indians, but when actual fighting in European wars starts, they say this is a responsibility of the professional soldiers, and the professional soldiers, the French have more in the Americas than the British. So that's something the French have going for them. And as we've talked about before, the French are, better scientific tactics, military tactics, probably better trained soldiers as well. All right, another thing that France has going for it is most of the Indians a lot of Indians are going to sort of stay out of that. You see that a lot down here among these Mississippi cultures, but the Indians that do join, they're almost all going to go to the French. So definitely the British have a numerical advantage, but the French do have a lot of things going for them. And as a matter of fact, you're going to see this almost immediately because the French are going to decide when war breaks out, we're going to take the offensive. And what happens is 1756, the French are actually going to start sending their professional soldiers to retake some territory or take some territory to sort of push back against the British. We're not going to wait for them to attack us. We'll take them. Basically, the French call out to their Indian allies, guys, we're going to attack the British. If you come with us, then we'll give you firearms. We'll give you trade goods. And a lot of these Indian groups will answer that call. Now, a good chunk of them are answering it just for the loot. Some are going to be joining them because they've been pushed west by the British. This is time for revenge. But a lot, hey, this is a way I can get firearms, which is going to provide security for me and my family, and that's why they join them. So what you see is these French soldiers and their Indian allies start marching on these British forts and taking one after another. And this goes from late 1756 to early 1757. And the way the French are generally going to take these forts from the British is they would surround them. They would their combined French-Indian force, and these British forts, generally a handful of professional soldiers manning them. When the French surround them, they basically say, "We got you surrounded. We're going to be able to beat you. We're going to lose a lot of men to beat you, but you're going to die when this thing's over. We might let our Indians kill you, something like that, unless you surrender." Well, most of the British will surrender because they don't want, to die, and the French would prefer the British surrender anyway because the French don't have, again, as many people in the New World, so they don't want to lose soldiers taking these forts. So when the French surround these various forts, end of 1756, beginning of 1757, there's a lot of, I don't want to say peaceful, but a lot of surrenders without violence. And what the French would then do is they would, whenever these surrenders happen, is they would tell the British, "We're seizing your weapons." A lot of times they would give the weapons to their Indian allies, and maybe take the British uniforms and go tell them go back east and don't fight anymore. So this happens one fort after another as the French are marching out of Canada, taking these British forts. Well, there's going to be a sort of snag when the French are going to reach this Fort William Henry right in this area. The French and their Indian allies will march on Fort William Henry with about 8,000 total men, so French soldiers and their Indian allies. And when they reach the region, they're going to call on the commander of Fort William Henry to surrender. He's going to be open to it, but basically he doesn't want to be dishonored, and he's going to say, we'll surrender, but we want to keep our weapons. French commander is going to say, okay, I'll agree to this. I don't want to lose men taking the fort, so you guys can surrender. When you surrender, though, we're going to take your ammunition and your gunpowder, so obviously you can't fight back. So British will surrender. The French will then take the British prisoners, and they're going to start prepping them to, send back east. You guys have surrendered this fort. Well, when this happens, the Indian allies of the French are going to start looking around like, well, where's our stuff? We joined you guys. Sure, we don't like the British, but we joined you mainly because we thought we were going to get guns out of this. Why aren't you guys making these guys give up their guns? Well, the French, hey, it's part of the surrender. Well, that's not what we're here for. And there's going to be this disagreement between the Indian allies of the French and the French to figure out about the terms of surrender. Well, what some of the Indians will decide to do is forget what the French are saying. They're going to go to where the British prisoners are being kept, and it's soldiers and also their families, their wives and children. And the Indians will go and say, all right, well, I'm just going to take these guns anyway. And they start removing the guns from the British prisoners. There's going to be scuffles breaking out. And essentially when this happens, these unarmed British soldiers, unarmed meaning they don't have ammunition, will start being chopped down by the French Indian allies. The Indians will end up taking some of the British women and children as slaves back to their village. They're going to start killing the men, taking their guns. The French are going to kind of try to stop this, like, hey, you guys, no, we're letting them keep our guns. This isn't the way to do things. But they're unsuccessful in doing this. And so we see that sort of this Fort William Henry, taking Fort William Henry sort of turns into this massacre. So why is this going to be important? Why are we talking about this fort when we didn't talk about the specifics of the other forts? Well, one thing that's going to happen is word is going to quickly spread about what happened at Fort William Henry, and it's going to spread to these colonists all up and down the coast. And these colonists up to this point had basically been saying, this is for the professional soldiers to fight the French. This isn't my responsibility. Generally, again, militia deal with Indians. If it's a war between the French, that's going to be the professional military's job, not my job. So a lot of these colonists had sat out this thing, but now word's coming, the French are close, and they're letting their Indians kill people, and they're taking women and children. So a lot of colonists are going to say, I better start joining up in this fight. And you'll start seeing these militia units form throughout the colonies to join up on the British side, and British professional soldiers will start being joined by large numbers of militia to support them. So this is going to be a result of Fort William Henry Massacre. Scares the colonists and encourages them to join the professional military in fighting. Another thing we're going to see come out of this, the French were actually scared that this is exactly what was going to happen. And so after this, they're basically looking at their Indian allies and they're saying, yeah, these guys are helping us. In battles they're great. But if this is what happens, if we have disagreements with them, if we keep using them, then basically it's going to continue to encourage these English colonists to join up in these militias. We don't want that. So after Fort William Henry, the French start separating from their Indian allies. They no longer fight with them, or at least not to the extent they did before Fort William Henry. And this is actually going to turn out to be a bad idea for the French because they're already at a severe numerical advantage. They're now at a greater one because they don't have their French or their Indian allies to fight with them. And now, in spite of doing that, the English colonists are going to be joining up with the professional military. So this numerical advantage is going to start coming to bear as the British start joining these militias and supporting the professional soldiers. And they're going to start retaking the various forts that the French had taken prior to this point. So 1757, 1758, we'll see the British and militia forces start pushing back into Canada. The French, they're well trained. There's accounts of 3,600 French soldiers beating 18,000 English and militia in battle. But you can't keep fighting that types of battles. If you have this many numbers going against you, you're going to continue to lose. So the French lose one battle after another, and by 1759, the British are starting to push into Canada. They're going to be aided by the fact that the British at home, Parliament is going to start borrowing money left and right. Basically, they're going to go to private British citizens. Hey, Madam Windsor, whatever the heck average British name is, Pennyworth, Miss Pennyworth, can I borrow some pounds? And what they're going to do is they're going to increase the size of their navy even further, hire more redcoats, and they're going to start sending these redcoats over to support the war. And they're going to prevent the French from sending reinforcements by sending these newly constructed naval ships to blockade French Canada. This is going to be a huge problem because the French get almost all their settlements on the St. Lawrence River, at least all the ones in Canada are, and they get all their supplies to this area. If the British blockade it, the French can't get new supplies in here. So you're going to see people start running out of gunpowder, things like that. And so they're going to be cut off from reinforcements. And also, the French king is basically going to decide, you know what, let's forget about the fighting over here. We're going to go ahead and win the war in Europe, defeat the British in Europe, and then, we'll get concessions of them when we beat them over there. The French sort of decide that it's not worth fighting in the colonies. The British will do differently. They're going to borrow money to support the fight. So British ships will start blockading, and this is going to allow for this invasion of Canada in 1759, 1760. The British will end up taking Quebec and Montreal. And by 1760, the war in North America is essentially over. Now, the British aren't going to invade Louisiana or anything like that, but they take the main population centers of New France or Canada from the French. Now, again, the war is going to continue for another 3 years. This is a picture of a British general that gets killed at the siege of, I believe it's Montreal or Quebec. British are going to have successes outside of Canada as well. Again, the Spanish had joined with the French. The British will seize Havana, which is this huge port for the Spanish. It's where the silver from Mexico met the silver coming up from South America. Now the British take it, and it looks like they could possibly cut off trade through this entire area. So the Spanish are going to be in a lot of trouble because of that. And again, back in Europe, the British have success as well. So by 1763, the Spanish and French realize the British have defeated us. In part, they've defeated us because their navy's so good, but the French are going to decide we've got to surrender. We're not going to win this thing. So in 1763, the British and French will sit down and sign something called the Treaty of Paris. There's a bunch of Treaty of Parises, but this isn't one. 1763, ending the 7 Years' War. What does the Treaty of Paris do? One thing it's going to do is it's going to give England a whole lot of new territory. All right. So the French had essentially lost this to the British. Well, what the French are going to decide is, okay, we lost this territory. We didn't lose Louisiana, but let's just go ahead and sign this over to the British. They insist upon it because of their victory. And they're going to look down here at Louisiana and they're going to say, you know what? Without the trade coming from up here, it's not worth it to keep this area down here. We had some agriculture down here, but one of the main ways we made money is from trade goods coming down the Mississippi. Without these trade goods, we're going to be spending more money on soldiers and things down here. So what's the point of keeping this Louisiana area? If we can't keep up here, we have to surrender this to the British. What the French are going to say to Spain is, hey, do you want Louisiana? Because we don't want it anymore. The Spanish will end up taking over Louisiana. The British will take over Canada as a condition of returning Havana to Spain. Spain will be forced to sign over Florida to the British. So the British will officially get Canada, and they're officially going to get Florida. The Spanish, basically, France says to them, "Hey, sorry, we just sorry you had to lose Florida. Do you want Louisiana?" Initially, Spain is going to say, I don't necessarily know if I want it. This is a lot of expense. But then the French are going to say, all right, well, if you don't want it, the British are going to take it, and they'll be right next to your silver mines. So the Spanish end up taking Louisiana. So that's kind of why the reason, if you go to Louisiana today, you'll see not just a French Quarter, but Spanish Street, things like that, because from 1763 to 1800, the Spanish are going to rule Louisiana. I should point out, even though the Spanish take over Louisiana, there's still going to be French citizens here. It's not like they're going to force the French people to leave. Same thing up here. The British are taking over these French citizens up here, but they're not going to force them to leave like they forced the Acadians to leave. And as we'll talk about later, basically the British are going to allow the French to continue to speak French, practice Catholicism, but basically they say now we're ruling this area. So a lot of land changes hands, and basically the British take over the eastern half of North America. The French are entirely out of North America. They're gone. We'll see them come back very briefly in 1800, but they're gone. I mean, they have Haiti still. They have these sugar islands down there, but they're no longer present. The Spanish lost Florida. Now they have Louisiana, but again, they're not going to be making a lot of money out of Louisiana. One final thing, or two final things we'll talk about this that are going to happen as a result of this 7 Years' War. The Indians of particularly this area here are going to lose a powerful ally. The French have been trading them guns, stuff like that, and they've been able to somewhat play off the French and British with one another. They can't any longer. So now some of these Indians down here are still going to be able to do that with the Spanish, but these Indians up here are going to be in a really unfortunate situation. Final thing as a result of the 7 Years' War, the British, in order to win this thing and sort of get rid of the French threat, had to spend a lot of money. The British Parliament was only £5 million in debt prior to the 7 Years' War. At the end of the 7 Years' War, they're going to be £133 million in debt. Who do you think they're going to be expecting to pay off this debt? We'll pick up with that next time.